Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I was looking at my calendar earlier this week and a date jumped off the page to me. February 3rd. Now, February 3rd was on Tuesday. Well, a historical event occurred on February 3rd a long time ago. February 3rd is actually known as Four Chaplains Day. Now, what exactly is Four Chaplains Day? Four Chaplains Day is actually a World War II story that I learned about in college. And what Four Chaplains Day was, it dealt with a ship called the SS Dorchester. Now, the Dorchester was actually a civilian liner, so it was a U.S. boat. So this is a U.S. civilian liner that in World War II had been converted to a troop transport. That was really the only way that the U.S. military could get troops over to England is by boat. So they would take these like civilian passenger liners and turn them into troop transports. Well, Dorchester had actually left New York with about 900 military passengers and crew. That Dorchester, the boat, the civilian liner, had been accompanied by 3 Coast Guard boats. So here's the Dorchester. It's heading over to England, right? It's heading over to Europe. It was en route to Greenland. Well, on February 3rd, 1943, the Dorchester was torpedoed. Dorchester, the civilian liner troop transport, was hit by a German sub, and that sub was U-223. The boat was actually close to Newfoundland when it was struck. Well, so this thing gets hit by a torpedo, and what happens? The electric goes out on the Dorchester, so it's a complete blackout. This was at night. Well, what happens then when this thing gets hit by a torpedo? They're trying to get the lifeboats out, but men are going into the water. Well, as men are going into the water, they ran out of life jackets. So these guys are running out of life jackets, and there are 4 chaplains that are on board this ship. What these chaplains did is that they realized the situation, and these chaplains took off their life jackets. These chaplains took off their own life jackets and gave them to other men. The chaplains then helped organize the escape from the boat. They helped load men into lifeboats. Well, as the Dorchester went down, again, pitch blackout, as the Dorchester is going down, the chaplains were on board praying and singing hymns. There were 904 men on the boat. Only 230 men survived this incident. And again, think about this. They're off the coast of Newfoundland. Hypothermia got most of them. When they went into the water, it was like freezing. It's almost like the Titanic, right? Hypothermia got most of the men that were not on the lifeboats. But all 4 of the chaplains went down with the ship. All 4 of those men, those 4 chaplains, won Distinguished Service Crosses and Purple Hearts. And it's interesting because they weren't just one religion. There were 4 guys. So George Fox, who was a Methodist, he was aged 42. Alexander Good was a rabbi. He was aged 31. A guy named Clark Poling, Protestant, aged 32. John Washington, a Catholic, aged 34. Well, and again, I mentioned I learned about this in college. In 1998, the Senate approved February 3rd as Four Chaplains Day. And that's when I heard about it. That incident is also called the Dorchester Chaplains or the Immortal Chaplains, if you're ever interested in looking it up online. But I just always thought it was such an interesting story because these chaplains, these men of God, gave their life jackets. They prayed and sang hymns to comfort others. And I guess I just think about all this stuff like that just really makes you wonder about like mankind today. Like, can you imagine this kind of bravery? Like every time I hear a story like that, like my heart is like lifted up and I'm like just totally amazed by the bravery and heroism of others. And I guess like, is that faith in God still here where people would do something like that to give themselves so selflessly? It's just such an amazing thing to watch that faith. But anyway, February 3rd was Four Chaplains Day. It's just a day to remember. So I had another quick hit from a story that I had talked about on Monday. So I had some bad news about Artemis, which is Artemis, again, is the ship that's going back around the moon. So I mentioned on February 2nd, again, Monday, they were going to fill the tanks. What they do is they fill the tanks to make sure there's no mechanical problems. Well, they ended up doing that. They call it a wet rehearsal. It's a wet dress rehearsal to fill the tanks. So apparently when they filled the tanks and then they started the process, they had a liquid hydrogen leak in one of the tanks. So they successfully filled the tanks, but the leak grew as they were filling. So what that does now is they're going to delay the whole launch. So NASA said Tuesday they're now targeting a March launch date, which is such a bummer. But you have to respect the process here. Like, I mean, you don't want these guys going up and having some kind of leak or some. Get it right. Make sure it's correct before you put these people out. I think the other issue that NASA had is they have to align the moon again, where how they're going to launch it. So the telemetry has to be just right when they do it. So it's going to be a March launch now. But anyway, big bummer. But anyway, safety is first. So just get excited for that thing to happen in March. So while I'm talking about space, I wanted to go ahead and talk about Elon Musk. I follow Elon Musk and what his companies do like very, very closely. And at least in my humble opinion, Elon Musk is probably the most important human alive right now. He is absolutely pushing mankind forward, regardless of what anybody thinks about him, like domestic politics, etc. I think the first thing to talk about is that SpaceX and XAI will be merging. Now, it's interesting because SpaceX and XAI were two private companies. They're going to merge as a private company. And then what they're going to do is they're going to be under the name of SpaceX. And the SpaceX IPO should be in June. Well, that value of the company today, so if you merge SpaceX and XAI, that's a private company, the value of those two companies merged is 1.25 trillion. Now, it's crazy to me, like looking at SpaceX and what they're doing with this. That SpaceX IPO is going to be the biggest IPO ever. They're looking right now at a $1.5 trillion valuation of the company. And I guess the only thing that Foggy Dew can tell you is get as much liquid cash as you can and buy as much as you can of that stock when it comes out. Now, I guess backing up to the merger of SpaceX and XAI, why is that a big deal? Well, just last week, SpaceX is actually looking at launching a whole new thing up into space. They just sought approval to launch 1 million satellites into space. And you might be asking yourself, like, that seems crazy. 1 million satellites. What are they doing? Well, what the plan is for SpaceX and these satellites is those satellites are going to operate as orbital data centers. So what they're doing is they're going to use solar energy, so like solar panels on the sides of these AI processors. So you can have solar panels that powers the AI on the satellite. So you're going to have advanced AI processing on these satellites powered by solar. Well, you've got 1 million of them up there, so they're not going to operate independently. So what they're going to do is they're going to have high-speed laser links that basically connect this system. So you're going to have like this infrastructure of satellite data centers linked together in space. So how does that work? So they're all linked together by lasers. And then what happens is that the satellites then transmit to ground-based receivers. And I guess it's just so interesting, like looking at the whole scope of this project and the broader, like global issue here. AI is growing faster at this point than the ground can provide, meaning like Earth-based energy production is not capable of keeping up with AI. AI needs more energy now, not like 10 years from now. And I guess if you look at this entire thing with SpaceX and the growth of like these AI data centers in space, that's not just important to the private company SpaceX, but that is very important to the United States writ large. And I guess why would that be? Why is space so important to the United States? Well, this entire situation is very critical to the United States because of China. Now, if you look at the situation on the ground with China, China today has 1/3 of the world's electricity production. The United States, you might be curious, the US only has 14%. So China is moving way quicker than we are on electricity. The United States has to get more electricity and fast. And the only thing I can tell you is we are way behind on electrical production. China knows this entire they play the long game. China knows this and they are moving fast. If you look at any projection coming out of China, by next year, China will be at 45% of the world's electricity production. So in a year, China is going to be 3x the US in terms of energy production for electrical. So I guess an easier way to look at this whole situation, you are sitting in an energy race for space. And SpaceX submitted this thing to the US, like to get permission to launch these satellites. The United States is absolutely going to fast track this whole thing to get these things up into orbit. You have got to get that system in orbit going immediately. You have to use solar. Humanity, the United States, SpaceX, we need off-world solar. It's critical. So I guess just a couple points here. When you look at the broader scope of this entire thing, I guess I would start with Space Force. It's almost funny to me because Donald Trump was laughed at by creating a fourth branch of the military, Space Force. Well, if you have an electrical grid in space, if the United States has interest, like economic interest in space, it is very reasonable that an enemy, i.e. China in this case, would attack that grid. Think about having a domestic energy grid, and then like China's not going to attack it physically on the ground. But if it's in space, I'm certain that they're going to try to destroy it, subvert it, whatever it is. But China or another aggressive country is absolutely going to be trying to interrupt that like in space electrical grid. And if you look at it that way, you 1000% need the military protecting these critical US assets in space. So I guess if you look at it again, like Donald Trump creating Space Force, maybe Donald Trump wasn't being stupid. Maybe he was thinking ahead. Because it certainly seems to me that having these assets in space is critical to us going ahead of China and moving off world. And I guess if you look at, just zoom the scope back even further, does this whole green energy initiative make more sense now to most people? The entire concept of green energy was designed to slow the US down. China had funded a lot of American green energy academia. They were pushing all these studies out of like Harvard and Yale that said that you shouldn't be doing this. You should, of course, because they want to advance their own interests. They saw this whole game. But China had been funding a lot of green energy politics and laws domestically in the US. China knew that this was the battlefield moving forward. Green energy initiatives, environmental protection laws, these have been used as a cudgel against American growth in this advancing energy sector, which of course is AI. Those laws, those initiatives are used as a restraining jacket. And I guess you don't have to look any further than like a Europe. Look at Europe. Europe will not allow energy development there. They're not going to drill. They have no new electrical. The laws there are very, very onerous for any company trying to create new energy systems in the European Union. They're too the laws that they have in the EU for energy production are just onerous. They're too restrictive to growth. Well, what's happening to Europe now? They're being completely left behind in this entire paradigm. And let's be honest, not only are they being left behind in the energy race, they're also becoming dependents. Europe depends on other countries for their energy, for electric, for gas, for oil. And I guess just looking at the entire scope here, like get liquid cash and buy SpaceX stock when it becomes available, because I can tell you right now, SpaceX, XAI, that's the future. AI in space is the future. And just looking at it as like an 80s kid science nerd, you're talking about a space network of AI fueled by the sun. How amazing is that? I just think it's the most interesting thing ever. But trust me, I'll be watching that entire thing very, very closely. But get excited about AI in space. So another quick hit. I wanted to talk about the Monroe Doctrine again. And I don't know if people are getting tired of me talking about this or not, but the Monroe Doctrine is going global. And the only thing I can tell you about the Monroe Doctrine, the rise of the United States from the ashes continues. It's like the phoenix. Trump continues to make huge moves on the global chessboard. Now, I've talked many times on the show about how the moves that he's making are designed to disrupt BRICS countries, disrupt their logistics in our hemisphere, to isolate the BRICS countries economically. Well, like I said, he keeps making moves. On Monday, Donald Trump and the administration announced another huge deal. Who was this new huge deal with? It was with India. Now, here are the mechanics of the deal. The U.S. will drop tariffs on Indian imports, so products that India is shipping into the U.S. The current tariff rate on Indian imports is 25%. So all new Indian products coming to the US are going to be moved to 18%. So India gets a 7% drop on its exports. Well, what that does is that's a big win for India. The US consumer is the largest consumer on the planet. That gives India better access to US consumers. Well, here's the best part when you look at like the Monroe Doctrine. India is going to drop US tariffs to 0%. Well, what does that do? That means domestic manufacturing for US products, you have a whole new market that is basically at equitable trade. So they can sell things domestically and now to India with a 0% tariffs. Well, what that does is that opens up the entire Indian market to US domestic manufacturing, crops, produce, textiles, goods, anything. But that is a massive, massive announcement for US manufacturing. And I guess talking about the Monroe Doctrine, how does this US-India deal affect BRICS? How does it hurt BRICS? This, again, the best part of this. Not only are we moving the tariffs rate down to 0, but India has agreed to stop buying Russian oil. That is going to hurt Russia big time. India not buying Russian oil? India is a huge consumer of oil. Well, who are they going to get their oil from? Guess who? India has now committed to buying US oil. This is just a massive win. So India committing to buying US oil, that is going to help US oil production as well. Remember, the US controls or has a vested stake in 50% of global oil now. Now, the only thing I can tell you, like, look at this in contrast to like a deal like Mark Carney made with China. This is the exact opposite. India made a very good deal here. India is seeing the chessboard and understanding where the wind is blowing. But the only thing I can tell you about the Trump administration, regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, his use of tariffs has been absolutely brilliant to increase US manufacturing and US prominence. Donald Trump continues to successfully leverage tariffs in global politics. And again, zoom the scope back. Russia just lost Cuba. We're going to do an energy embargo on Cuba. Russia just lost India. I talked about this the other day. These BRICS countries are being isolated economically. They are losing customers. Russia just lost this hemisphere. They just lost India. These are massive moves. Congratulations to the Trump administration. I think these are brilliant deals. And let's be honest, congrats to India. That's a very, very smart deal for India. And those guys should be, again, look at Carney. Look at the EU. The EU is making really bad deals. Mark Carney, and these are just WEF countries and puppets making bad deals, but like India is making a smart deal. I just think it's brilliant. And I guess I had one other good piece of news for this hemisphere, because I'm always looking at this stuff. I'm trying to figure out like where we're going, like in this hemisphere in global politics and watching elections. But other good news for this hemisphere, there was a huge election in Costa Rica the other day. A hardline right-winger just won in Costa Rica. And that person that won is a person named Laura Fernandez. She's a right-wing populist. But if you look at like the countries that are electing leaders in Central America, that is another huge win in Central America for right-wing populism. And I guess I would tell you that smart governance now in this hemisphere is right-wing. China, Russia, Iran, etc., they're not going to be involved in these countries anymore because a right-wing populist government in like a Central America is going to obviously gravitate towards the US just from a proximal standpoint. And let's be honest, those countries in Central America have to align with the US. The US is involved in right-wing populism right now. Right-wing populism in this hemisphere is totally ascendant. Look at the chessboard. Just in Central America, you have El Salvador, Honduras, Panama. Now you have Costa Rica. And I guess I would tell anybody more broadly, like, these countries are seeing the light. They are seeing the global chessboard. And I guess the pioneer there was Bukele in El Salvador. What Bukele has done in El Salvador is nothing short of amazing. He was a right-wing populist that cracked down hard on crime. Well, guess what Fernandez did? Fernandez basically carbon copied the Bukele model and won. These are just massive, massive moves on the global chessboard. But congratulations to the Trump administration on India, and congratulations to the people of Costa Rica. You got good things to look forward to in your future. So I had another quick hit for you that I laughed out loud watching this. So I talk on the show a lot about that kid named Nick Shirley. Nick Shirley was the kid that exposed Minnesota. Remember, that video came out like at Christmas time. So it was like 5 or 6 weeks ago, and look at what's happened in Minnesota with Tim Walz. But that Nick Shirley kid, just so everybody's on the same page, Nick Shirley was the kid that reported on the fraud coming out of Minnesota, and he totally exposed Tim Walz. And I have said on the show many times that California was next. Well, guess what? Nick Shirley announced like a week ago that he was going to California, and Nick Shirley is already posting data about California. Not only is Nick Shirley posting data, but Fox News, a mainstream media source, is now dropping his information. And I guess the only thing I would tell you about this entire situation, this was so predictable. I said before, and I'm going to say it again, Gavin Newsom is in a lot of trouble. He's in a lot of trouble. The fraud in California is off the charts, and this guy's going to get exposed. But it's just so interesting and predictable. Here's some initial data coming out about California. And again, this is Fox News reporting this. So here's number one. 18% of the entire country, meaning the entirety of the U.S., so one-fifth of U.S. home healthcare billing is in L.A. County. I'm going to repeat that. 1/5 of all home healthcare billing is in one county. Basically 20% of the entire country's home healthcare billing. This point two, one doctor in LA County billed the federal government $120 million in 1 year. One doctor billed $120 million. He only saw 1,900 patients. Just doing the math on that, that is about $63,000 per patient for one doctor. You think that's not fraud? Here's another thing that Shirley already came out. California has 2,000 hospice agencies. LA County, again, the epicenter of this, LA County has more hospice agencies than 36 states. So 36 states in hospice centers in one county. LA County has more hospice centers than Florida and New York combined. Not just by a little bit, by 30 times. I'm going to say that again. LA County has 30 times more hospice centers than Florida and New York combined. They have 287 hospice centers in a 2-mile radius. And if Shirley was showing some of this stuff, it's like strip malls, unmarked buildings, parking lots. It's all just bogus paperwork. 287 hospice centers in a 2-mile. Man, they better just stacking bodies in that county. And the only thing I would tell you is like, you're a week into this investigation, a week. And again, I mentioned it a minute ago, Gavin Newsom is going to be exactly like Tim Walz. It took 6 weeks for Tim Walz, who was a VP candidate, for him never to run for office again. Gavin Newsom's in a lot of trouble. The state of California is going to get exposed. The amount of fraud going on here is just unreal. And the only thing I can tell you, just looking at this and watching how this is playing out, this is going to get much, much worse. And I guess just looking at this entire situation, it's very hard to tell me as like an average person that the government, state or federal, needs to raise taxes when there's this much fraud occurring. Like, how could you legitimately sit there and go, we just need more tax money? The waste that is going on here is just profligate. And I'm so glad it's being exposed. But it is really hard for anybody, right or left, to sit there and say that we need new taxes when you're talking about this level of fraud going on in these states. Congratulations to Nick Shirley. This is just keep up the great work. But if you're a blue or red state governor, you better be sweating it. I think having this level of exposure is just terrific. Keep it up. So one last quick hit. On Monday, I had talked about these trans lawsuits about how a girl named Fox Varian had won a lawsuit and got $2 million. And if you'll remember, this Fox Varian person was 16 years old, and her plastic surgeon and her psychologist urged her to get a double mastectomy. They urged drug therapy on this child. Well, the outcome of that lawsuit is that these doctors were found medically liable. They were found guilty of medical malpractice. And so I had talked about that this is going to start an avalanche of lawsuits. Well, on Tuesday, more news broke. Well, on Tuesday, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons came out with a new position. So the American Society of Plastic Surgeons now is opposing gender-affirming surgery. This Society of Plastic Surgeons is now acknowledging the risks of endocrine interventions. So here you have the governing body of plastic surgeons that just saw this lawsuit drop, and they're already changing their position. And I guess my point is, this confirms 1,000% what I said the other day. All of these physicians that did these surgeries on minors are now totally liable. And I guess good. But the only thing I would tell you looking at this entire paradigm is that you are going to see either thousands of individual lawsuits or you're going to see class action lawsuits. Because the individual doctors now, what they're going to claim is that they were following society guidelines, that they were following like the academy said we should do X, Y, Z. And I guess I checked the clock and it's lawsuit time. If these individual physicians are not found individually liable, then there's going to be a class action lawsuit against all these doctors. And the only thing I know about law, and this was made very evident in Nuremberg, is that, air quotes, just following orders is not a defense. You have to make individual decisions about medical care, and these doctors failed. And it's interesting looking at the entire scope of this because another entity had news about this same issue. Children's Minnesota, which is one of the leaders in trans medicine, Children's Minnesota had news on Tuesday as well. Immediately, Children's Minnesota is suspending prescription of puberty blockers. Children's Minnesota now is stopping puberty blockers, and they are stopping hormone therapy. They're stopping it for who? People seeking gender-affirming care. So Children's Minnesota has just done a complete 180 because they know they're totally liable. And I guess the translation is they're not stopping puberty blockers. They're just covering their ass. And I guess just looking at all this stuff and watching this kind of like panicked retreat by these medical organizations, it makes me just step back and think about COVID. And I've talked before on the show about I look at everything through the lens of COVID. And the only thing I can tell you about like this situation with like trans people is this is yet another example of central medicine failing. How a centralized medical body fails. It's like the CDC or the FDA during COVID. These, or like even the WHO, the World Health Organization. The central medical body pushes recommendations down to individual physicians. And these individual physicians and doctors don't ask any questions. They just take their marching orders. And if you look at it, that was the failure of the COVID vaccine rollout. Because if anybody on the medical community, like an individual doctor, wanted to speak out about it, they're like, hey, maybe this doesn't seem right. Well, if you spoke out about it in COVID specifically, like, you'd lose your medical license. You would lose your practice. And it's no different than a plastic surgeon with this trans stuff. If you're an individual like plastic surgeon, be like, you know what, this doesn't seem right. But what are you going to go argue against your academy? You're going to go argue against your society? They just take orders, man. Because if you go against like the medical establishment, I think that's been proven now in the last 5-6 years. If you go against the medical establishment, like the monolith of medical establishment, you are a medical pariah. You are labeled a science denier. It's like this like dogmatic adherence to process. They can't think outside this own like box that they've been put in. And I guess like when you look at like these centralized medical things, like nobody at the CDC, nobody at the FDA, they ask the right questions either about trans or COVID. It's just central board recommendations provides cover to individual physicians, and they provide medical legitimacy. Because like you could say, oh, okay, like I think trans therapy and like recommending a double mastectomy for a 16-year-old is a good idea because the American Society of whatever says it. And I guess just looking at this entire scenario, like forget about COVID, forget about trans, look at like the vaccine debate. RFK and the MAHA guys in the FDA and CDC, home health, they're moving the vaccine schedule down from like what? I think it was like 80 vaccines for a 2-year-old down to like 15 to 20 vaccines. What was the reflexive response of the medical establishment community? It's like a stimulus response of an amoeba. They move from 80 vaccines down to 15 or whatever. And it's like, oh, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his merry band of science deniers. No, this is just common sense. And this medical establishment like the FDA, CDC, the WHO, this plastic surgery board or whatever, it's just the same thing. And I guess it's the thing that bothers me about this entire conversation. And again, I've said it before, like this trans argument just makes me mental. But I guess my point in any of this is like, at what point do these defenders of science stop squealing about this? Haven't they been? It's like a cult member. They're like the priests of a religion. Well, the science says this. The experts say this. The establishment medical class says this. And it would seem just to be common sense as a dispassionate observer, like, wouldn't you be questioning things at this point? Like if you're an individual doctor or a patient, like, wouldn't you kind of question what's going on in centralized medicine? And actually, it's funny because I was talking about like the United States walking away from the World Health Organization. I think I talked about it last week. I think that's a great move. The World Health Organization, the WHO, is basically like the UN, but in like white lab coats. Walking away from the WHO, who got everything wrong in COVID, is common sense. The WHO is centralized global medicine. And I guess the funny thing about it is like, do you remember when the United States pulled out, like, it's again, stimulus response of an amoeba? The minute that Donald Trump and his merry band of science deniers pulled out of the WHO, Gavin Newsom and California decided to join the WHO. And the funny thing about that is California is totally bankrupt. California wants a centralized bureaucracy, and we've seen what the end result of that is. It is a complete economic failure. They're doubling down on failure. And it's funny because, like, looking at that entire situation, we now have another state that just joined the WHO. So we have another individual state that's decided to violate the Constitution and join the WHO. What state is that? Illinois. J.B. Pritzker in Illinois on Wednesday joined the WHO. And I've got to laugh. That's just perfect. That's perfect. J.B. Pritzker doing that. If anybody knows about good health, it's J.B. Pritzker. Like, how do those things even exist in the same universe? J.B. Pritzker and good health decisions are not two things that I think about when I think about J.B. Pritzker. Like, listening to J.B. Pritzker about health decisions is like talking to my dog about quantum mechanics. J.B. Pritzker telling me how to manage my health is like swimming with a barbell. I mean, are you serious? Illinois is $200 billion in debt. That's their unfunded liability. Illinois' 2026 budget, I think they have a $3 billion shortfall. Illinois is as broke as California is, if not, I think Illinois is the most bankrupt state in the country. And the only thing I can tell you, like being as close to medical as I am, IDPA, which is Illinois Medicaid is like $3 billion in debt. So like the people that they claim to care about, which is like low-income families, cannot get medical services. And if people provide medical services through Illinois Medicaid, they get stuck with the bill. But it's just funny looking at Illinois is one of the brokest states in the unions. And they're totally broke, economically illiterate, but sure, they know all about how to manage your health. All you have to do is look at the demographic shift. People are leaving California and Illinois in droves. But Pritzker, that is just absolutely classic. Total failure by Nepo baby Pritzker. Keep doubling down, man. I think anybody with two brain cells saw the COVID failure. Keep doubling down on the World Health Organization brought you every COVID failure. Why would anybody with two brain cells want to continue doubling down on that? And you know what? I love it. Keep it up, JB Pritzker. You make writing a show very, very easy for me. So thank you for all the laughs. Okay, so switching gears, I have a fun story that I've been sitting on, and I have a bunch of other stuff I want to get to, but I really wanted to get this story out there just to kind of wrap the show up for the week. But this story was from the early part of the Civil War, so in 1862. And this is a story you have probably never heard before, and it's called the Great Locomotive Chase. Well, by 1862, the Civil War was like in full swing. Remember, it started in 61. Well, a critical battle state during the Civil War was Tennessee. Now, the Union general in Tennessee was a guy named Mitchell. Well, Mitchell's job was to make, because Tennessee's like right geographically on the border there, right? So Mitchell, one of his main priorities was to make sure that the Confederates didn't move north. And Mitchell's main problem with that entire objective was Chattanooga. That was his main problem. Now, Chattanooga, Tennessee during the Civil War in 1862 was controlled by the Confederate Army. Well, Mitchell's problem with Chattanooga, he had a couple problems with Chattanooga, but number one is Mitchell could not attack Chattanooga directly. Now, you got to remember when any one of these Confederate or Union Army would attack a city, what they would do is when a city was attacked in the Civil War, it would be physically surrounded. So the army would surround the city. They would surround the city to cut off escape, to cut off supply routes, and then they would begin an inward assault. Chattanooga is a little bit different. You cannot do that with Chattanooga. It's got a very strange geography where there's mountains and stuff, and there's not a way to really surround the city. Well, that geography that Mitchell was dealing with in Chattanooga meant that Mitchell could not surround it. Well, not only could Mitchell not surround it, he had another issue with Chattanooga, and that was railroads. Now, the interesting thing about the railroads into Chattanooga, Atlanta, which was the key stronghold of the Confederacy, they had multiple railways into Chattanooga. So what would happen is if Chattanooga was ever attacked, what Chattanooga would do is that they would literally wire Atlanta and say, hey, we're being attacked, send troops, send supplies, etc., and they would ship it all via rail. So Atlanta would then reinforce Chattanooga immediately, so any Union assault would be stymied by that. So I guess basically just looking at this entire thing is General Mitchell, the Union commander in Tennessee, had a Chattanooga problem. So Mitchell needs a plan. He cannot allow Chattanooga to just sit there like that. So into this entire Chattanooga problem enters a guy named James Andrews, who was a civilian. He was a civilian and a Union spy. Well, this James Andrew guy has a very daring plan that he presents to Mitchell. So here's the plan. What Andrews wanted to do, he wanted to take a very small crew to a place called Big Shanty, Georgia. That small crew in Big Shanty, Georgia would then steal a rail car. So they would steal a rail car and then head north. So Andrews and his small gang steal this rail car and travel north on that stolen rail. What they would do is destroy everything behind them. They would destroy a rail line. They would destroy a telegraph wire. They would destroy bridges. Andrews would destroy the rail line. What that would do then, by destroying the rail line and all the communications, is that would cut Chattanooga off from Atlanta. As Andrews was doing this, cutting the railway off, Mitchell could do a frontal assault on Chattanooga. So it was a two-prong attack. Mitchell goes, you know what? This sounds like a great idea. So Andrews gets 23 guys. Those 23 guys were known as Andrews Raiders. So what they did, they had to infiltrate south. So they obviously couldn't wear their Union blues. So these Andrews Raiders guys dressed as civilians and they headed south as spies. So April 12th, 1862, Anderson and his men go to work. And you might ask, why did they pick Big Shanty, Georgia? Big Shanty, Georgia did not have a telegraph wire. So, meaning if they had attacked a place with a telegraph wire, everybody would be immediately alerted and this whole thing wouldn't work. So these guys penetrate down to Big Shanty, Georgia, and they end up stealing a rail car. That rail car that they stole was named General. So Andrews and his men then flee north on this stolen train named General. Well, Andrews, obviously people saw them doing this. Andrews was then pursued by the General's conductor, who was a Confederate guy. Well, these Confederates start pursuing General on a handcar. So imagine a train going north, and then you have the Confederates following him on a handcar. Well, now you got to chase. So the Confederates now are chasing Anderson north on a handcar. So these guys pursue the General to another city, and then they're like, okay, we're at another city. So imagine they go up just however far they go up, they run into a city. Well, they're like, a handcar's too slow. We really need a locomotive. So the Confederate guys ditch the handcar and they jump on a locomotive. So now you have a Confederate locomotive chasing the other locomotive, which is Andrews and these guys on the General. So Andrews and his guys end up stopping to destroy a section of track. Well, so what happens is they destroy this section of track and then they keep moving forward. Well, the Confederates on their locomotive end up coming to this busted section of track. They can't go any further on the locomotive. Well, that track destruction ended up forcing the Confederates to pursue them on foot. Now remember the situation here. Andrews is fleeing north. Well, every time Andrews stops the train, his pursuers get closer. The handcar can actually keep up with the train. The locomotive can keep up. But every time Andrews stops, he's wasting valuable times where the Confederates are closing the gap. Well, here come the Confederates. They keep coming. Now they're on foot. First they're on a handcar, rail car, now on foot. Well, finally what happened is that the Confederates, they're running, and then they finally come across a parked southbound railroad. So you've got a car literally facing south towards Atlanta. What did they do? These guys jump on this southbound rail car and end up driving it backwards north. So the Confederates are on foot, find a rail car, find a southbound pointed train, and they run the southbound train northward. So you've got the General fleeing north, and now you have a Confederate rail car going backwards up a southbound line. Well, by this point, everybody, the Confederacy knew what was going on here. The Confederate Army, everybody along the way is totally aware of what's happening. So what happened next? Well, Andrews and the Union soldiers on the General finally runs out of fuel. So this thing just comes to a complete stop in the middle of a field. Well, Andrews and these guys are like, okay, now we're in a lot of trouble. So they end up scattering out of the train. They scattered away from General. The bottom line of this is that Andrews and his men were unable to inflict any serious damage on the rail line. What happened to those men? They scattered. All of the men, all of Andrews' men were caught within weeks. Well, what do you think they did with these guys? Andrews and all of his guys are caught and they're put on trial. Andrews and those guys were charged as spies. What happened to Andrews? Andrews was convicted and hanged. 7 of the other men were hanged as well. So you had Andrews hanged, you had 7 other guys hanged. Well, the rest of the other men, Andrews' men, were imprisoned. So these guys that were in prison were marked for hanging also. So these guys are sitting there like, we're going to get hung. So these guys ended up doing a jailbreak. 8 of those guys escaped. So 8 of Andrews' guys escaped from jail. They were marked for hanging. They escaped from jail and headed north. Traveling hundreds of miles in pairs, they slipped north. Those 8 men finally got across into Union lines. But that entire situation became known as the Great Railroad Chase. Now, it's funny because I talked about General Mitchell and his assault on Chattanooga. Well, Mitchell had gone through with his part and attacked Chattanooga. Well, that whole thing failed. They were repulsed. So I guess broadly, when you look at this entire situation about the attack on Chattanooga with the Great Railroad Chase and then General Mitchell, the entire thing was a Union failure. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. If this wasn't interesting enough, the survivors of that, the 8 guys that got out of it, had actually met with President Lincoln. Right before this event occurred, Lincoln and the War Department had created a new award. That award, the Medal of Honor. All of the participants of the Great Locomotive Chase won the Medal of Honor. What that means is that the first Medal of Honor ever was given to a man in this group. That first Medal of Honor was given to a guy named Private Jacob Parrott, who was one of Andrew's men. Private Jacob Parrott was the first man ever in U.S. history to win a Medal of Honor. Why did Parrott get it first? Parrott had actually been physically abused as a prisoner, like they beat him. So 19 guys won the Medal of Honor for the Great Railroad Chase. Adams, the leader, did not because he was a civilian. But every military member that was involved in that won a Medal of Honor. Now, the other interesting wrinkle to that is that they had met with Lincoln. That actually started the tradition of the president awarding men with the Medal of Honor personally. If you get a Medal of Honor, the president puts it on you personally, and that all started with Jacob Parrott and Lincoln and the Great Railroad Chase. Anyway, that's one of like my favorite stories from the Civil War, and I just thought I'd pass. I've been sitting on it. I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and do it. Okay, so a quick programming note. We have the Super Bowl this weekend. Both of my kids, for some reason, are off on Monday, which I don't understand. So we've got a couple plans with the kids on Monday and over the weekend, obviously. So I think the next episode we'll have out, that will come out with the Dew will be on Tuesday. But just keep your eyes peeled. We'll be coming out with more content soon. So anyway, if you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you'd like to ask the show a question, please go ahead and email the show at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.